Hi Arun, I'm pleased to have you with us today. So just to introduce Arun Sundarajan, just to introduce Professor Arun Sundarajan, he's the Harold Price Professor for Entrepreneurship and Professor for Tech Operations and Statistics, and presently focused on a bunch of issues including future of capitalism, artificial intelligence, and platform-enabled change. And he's also the author of a very interesting book called The Sharing Economy. Arun, thank you so much for joining me.
Delighted to be here, Govindraj.
Yeah, and finally. So, I thought we'll talk about 2 or 3 dots in connecting the dots. One is the present of AI, and because that itself is such a challenge and there's so much being said at this point. The second, obviously, is the future and what does it look like? And third is obviously where do we all fit in that? And should we be mortally scared, or should we feel optimistic, or essentially how should we be dealing with it?
Sounds like a great plan.
Yeah. So let's talk about the present of AI first. And currently we are still at this point where we are awestruck by what we are seeing around us. Even, not just ChatGPT itself or regenerative AI, but also the way people are finding interesting applications. And every day there's a firm, or maybe many firms, who are using ChatGPT API to create something interesting of their own. So tell us about how you're seeing this evolve.
Well, I'm very excited by the emergence of generative AI. And I think it's been a long journey in many ways, back from the expert systems of the 1990s to the rise of machine learning since the mid-1990s. Then the coming of age of finding your own features with neural networks where you didn't have to rely on the humans to say this is what matters. And now to the generation of these large language models that are able to generate content on their own, able to generate images on their own. I think one of the things that's most compelling about these large language models is the way in which you can relatively easily customize them with a few examples to do something new. It's like having an incredibly smart person who has a real breadth of general knowledge and who knows all of the rules of English and so on. And if you just give them a few instances of something new, here's how to rank reviews. Here's a bunch of conversations with my customers. Here's a bunch of specialized information about my particular line of business, that they can use the general knowledge that they have and they use the language knowledge that they have to suddenly become an expert in what you want them to become an expert in. And so I think we're in a very early stage we're just sort of scratching the surface in terms of what the potential of these large language models are going to be for specialized business applications.
And that's interesting because it's also a very frightening description, because what you're saying is that someone who's essentially a master of none suddenly becomes an expert in something.
That's true, and we haven't tested yet the depth of this expertise. But we could create, for example, a digital twin of Govind. There's plenty of content out there that describes how you think, how you write, how you speak, and so it wouldn't take too long to fine-tune a GPT model to start to generate content like you. Now, the open question is how far can it go in terms of matching the human Govind, and that's an empirical question that we're going to have to see the answer to over time.
And you use this example because you feel that people are already working on this.
Oh, they have worked on it already. Yeah. There are some good examples. Like the Khan Academy has a teaching assistant called Khan Migo, which they spent a lot of time fine-tuning in collaboration with Microsoft. That does a better job than any digital teaching assistant that I've encountered in being able to not give you the answers, but teach you how to understand something. And again, this was sort of fine-tuned to the specific application of education. I'm seeing examples in a wide variety of other domains as well. I think healthcare is a very exciting example where you can dramatically expand the reach of particular kinds of sort of non-critical healthcare to areas where you may not have a qualified doctor, or you may not have a person who is qualified to elicit symptoms and then give an opinion. And so, yeah, the sky's the limit at this point.
And you also see similar application in financial systems or financial planning?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the areas where there's a very huge market potential is in sort of mid-range financial advice. And part of the reason for that is that the set of people who have a dedicated human financial advisor is currently much smaller than the set of people who could benefit from a dedicated human financial advisor, but just can't afford one. From the financial advisor's point of view, there's no real business model for them to answer a few questions from a lot of people. They tend to sort of build deep relationships with a small number of high net worth or sort of mid to high range net worth people. And so in that space, I think the LLM-based financial advisors are going to take off once we figure out how can we train them in a way that elicits sufficient trust from a person who is seeking that financial advice.
Right.
I mean, one of the interesting things that has come up on the trust front is, at least in the US, it's much easier to get someone to trust an AI-based system for healthcare advice than it is to get them to trust an AI-based system for financial advice.
Wow.
Because and it really has to do with what is the human equivalent. Again, in the US, your typical experience with a doctor is largely someone you don't know, who's wearing a white coat and thus you trust. They say they're the doctor, they tell you what's wrong with you and you trust them. So the AI experience is not that far away. On the other hand, in financial advice, for a lot of people, there's no sort of analogous human experience. For the few people who have a dedicated financial advisor, the trust has built over years. And so, just listening to a bot after a few minutes of interaction does not ramp up trust to the level that's necessary to take consequential decisions.
Right. That's interesting. And I'm going to come back to how all this could affect people and jobs and so on, but that's later. So you're talking about AI making us lose the intellectual property rights over our own intelligence. At a TEDx Gateway talk. So tell us about that. I mean, it sounds, again, a combination of excitement and frightening.
That's true. I mean, it's something that, it's an issue that isn't very widely discussed, but which I'm increasingly concerned about. And, because of the ease with which these new generative AI systems can be customized to, do a specific thing, that specific thing can mimic the creative behavior of a particular individual. We've already seen it happen in the music and art domains, where pretty much any band that you pick, you can train a generative AI model to create new music in the style of that band that is indistinguishable from what the humans have created. It's the same thing with cartoonists. You can create
and we are seeing that already all over social media.
Yeah, and so so in some ways you're taking away someone's ability to own how they create. And I guess tomorrow this will come to the more corporate sector where maybe you'll start out by saying, let's train a large language model to be my digital twin to offload some work. It can draft memos in my voice, it can reply to email. But there's no guarantee that this digital twin is not going to stay behind if you switch employers. And that's the issue that I'm trying to raise awareness of and come up with a solution for, which is that as things currently stand, we haven't really thought about what are our intellectual property rights over our creative process. It's all been around specific instances of what we create. And this isn't the fault of the lawyers or the legislators, right? I mean, they never really had to think about, do you own your intelligence? I mean, it was by default, of course you do. So I think the solution really lies in extending, in some ways, the intellectual property infrastructure to cover if something is trained specifically to replicate parts of a human being, then the human being should have ownership rights over that replica and some kind of joint ownership claim over what that replica creates. So if your AI generates new content, you should have some kind of ownership rights over it, the way you have ownership rights over what you generate.
in music.
Yeah.
So if you were to extend that music example, so today we know that, okay, there is an IPR system in music. I have music rights. I could be Michael Jackson, who's passed on, lived in the US, but the royalties continue to flow through various streams from all over the world, through record companies, and maybe finally to his estate and so on. So would this be sort of this extend itself? But I'm also wondering how you would capture, because you have to train someone to capture the fact that it was Michael Jackson's talent which was used to create this, though he's not around.
Well, that's the beauty of the new generation of AI, right? I mean, that's where the machine learning revolution took us, where you don't actually have to know how the AI is generating stuff. If you just give it enough examples of how to generate things, it can learn in a way that we don't fully understand, and it can start to generate new music in Michael Jackson's style. The open question now is, if someone comes up with a way to train a Michael Jackson music creator, should Michael Jackson's estate have claims over both, that generator and the music that it generates? And I would argue that if you move away from people who are really famous to individuals who may not have the same market and may not be musicians or artists, who may be, sort of writing.
I mean, it could be someone like you who has a lot of intellectual property out there.
Or
in the form of books.
Or someone like you, for that matter, who's got a particular style of writing, who's got a particular way of analyzing things, and that's something that you have created based on your experience and based on your journey. If you don't have ownership over that, then my worry is that over time people will not think that there's enough incentive to create this kind of capability, because once you've created a few examples based on this capability, anybody can pick them up and replicate you.
Right. And is perhaps in keeping all this in mind is why some tech companies are already soliciting legislation. And is that because they are trying to catch up and they want time to catch up, or because they are genuinely worried about what this can do?
Well, I think it's a mix of different reasons. I think everybody who has thought about AI policy realizes that there's no comprehensive way in which technology can be the solution. Right? I mean, take the simple example of creating deepfake videos. That technology is out there, right? I mean, saying that the technology companies have to prevent this from happening technologically is simply not possible anymore. The only solution is legislative, to say that creating deepfakes is illegal in some way. Misuse of your likeness is illegal. Misuse of your voice is illegal. Creating a digital twin of yours without your consent, some of these things simply have to be illegal. And I think what that's going to require is sort of striking the right balance between openness and sort of chasing innovation, and some sort of licensing and control. One thing that I think is a good idea is to, at least in the early stages, if you classify a particular AI as having sufficient risk, to only allow people who have licensed infrastructure to be able to run that kind of AI commercially. So some people are calling this know your cloud, sort of a new kind of KYC. And so it's sort of a, in the past, when looking at sort of tech-related regulatory questions, my initial instinct has always been, let's go down the self-regulation path and then wrap the government around where we see market failure. But this is an exception. This is a case where it is very clear that legislation has to lead the way. Are the tech companies asking for legislation because they genuinely want the problem solved? I think it's partly because they realize that the solution has to be a combination. I think it's also in part because it allows you to, if you're a large tech company, having sort of a robust regulatory infrastructure early on may preserve your leadership position at a time when a lot of this AI is going open source. and there is a worry about how am I going to retain any of the value that I'm creating. And so I think it's less about catch up to your original question, because it's not just, Google and Microsoft are leaders in different ways. I mean, Microsoft and OpenAI have won the initial chatbot war, but Google has perhaps the deepest bench of AI talent in the world. They may not release it as fast because it might interfere a little with their search business, and so they've got a different kind of balancing act to strike. But these are both companies in leadership positions, and they're both calling for regulation. So I think it's a combination of wanting to make sure that AI suddenly isn't banned completely because terrible things happen, and wanting to make sure that their leadership position is preserved to some extent and not constantly threatened by open source and sort of small companies.
Right. And I mean, you said terrible things happen, right? And disinformation comes to mind. Sam Altman himself is on record to say that that's one of the biggest downsides of ChatGPT as he sees it. So where will this go, and how could this go as things stand in your own understanding?
Well, a couple of things could happen, right? I mean, one is we may start to rely more and more on content that is generated by an AI as our initial point of generating content itself. We may start to believe that the answers that are coming from large language models are the right answers. And if you go down into how a large language model, something that is sitting underneath ChatGPT, works, people often ask me, like, why does ChatGPT get things wrong? Why does it make up things? And part of my answer is that you have to realize that ChatGPT is making up everything that it says. Every word is made up. I mean, the surprising part is that so much of it is actually correct and true. And if we don't sort of get a good regulatory system around this early, I mean, we, of course, run the risk of rampant misinformation, potentially hate speech. We also have to pay very close attention to the kind of bias that is embedded in these large language models, because again, they're not programmed in a particular way. They're learning from examples, and so they may have a particular cultural orientation that may not represent, like, the global context in which they're applied. They certainly have some traditional sort of patriarchal bias in them. If you ask
patriarchal bias, liberal bias.
Yeah. So if you ask about scientific discoveries, they're more likely to make up the name of a man rather than a woman. If you ask about company founders, and I've tried all this, you make up the name of a company and say who founded this company, it'll give you the name of an Indian man.
Okay, that's
so
interesting.
This is sort of the particular cultural and patriarchal bias that ChatGPT has. So these are some of the early dangers. I think in the longer run, it really has to do with loss of control over our intelligence. And at some point, you'll reach a place where I don't believe that AI can generate all of its knowledge itself. I mean, you're going to have to inject human-created knowledge into the process, but we shouldn't reach a point where there's no incentive for a human being to do this.
And that's a good segue to asking about what things are going to look like as you look ahead, and which I'm assuming is not too far out.
Yeah.
And also let me put that question in the context of a country like India. We have very manpower intensive jobs, businesses, IT services, exports. So and a lot of that is let's say, I mean, the value addition is lower, and I guess therefore the fear that AI in many forms could take that over.
It's a little early to make bold predictions about exactly where this new type of AI is going to displace jobs. But early indications are that these large language models are very good at a few things. They're very good at coming up with first drafts, so initial content ideation and generation. They're fairly good at content summarization. They're very good at structured conversation. Even specialized conversation. So if you give a large language model enough examples that pertain to technical support for a particular television, it can learn how to provide technical support for this television relatively fast. And so all of these, and they're also very good at creating simple computer programs. So as the complexity grows, I think they are limited still. And so if you think about jobs that involve understanding the syntax of a language and generating simple computer programs that other more expert programmers then assemble, if you look at customer support, and if you look at sort of the less thoughtful branches of journalism that are generating clickbait, for example, anyone who is in any of these professions is facing a serious and immediate threat from large language models. I think certainly on the customer support line, on the customer support side, and on the sort of the less complex computer programming side, both of these could hit India, because there are sort of large fractions of the global workforce in each of these areas do sit in India, and so those are two areas where I think people should pay attention.
Yeah, and let me sort of ask you a question which I've also wondered about. So in India there's been a lot of emphasis on learning coding early, and maybe elsewhere too in the world. How do you see that? I mean, do you still feel it's necessary? Should we be now thinking of something else rather than just coding? Particularly young people, even children.
Yeah, I still think it's a really good idea to teach people computer programming early on. And part of the reason is for the same reason why it's good to teach them math. It wires your brain in a way that is good. Like, you are sort of learning certain ways of thinking and ways of problem solving through the programming. I think the emphasis should be more on concepts and less on syntax. So I don't think there's much of a return from being the expert who knows exactly the Python command to solve a particular problem, but understanding recursion, understanding these concepts, I think that's still valuable, because we're not going out into the job and doing differential calculus, right? But we are benefiting from having, I think we are benefiting from having learned that in middle school or high school.
Right.
So in the same way, I would encourage continued coding, but with a shift away from sort of being able to build things that actually work, and towards sort of a deeper and deeper emphasis on the concepts and the thinking.
Right. Last few questions. So one is, how should organizations be looking at this? I'm talking about the opportunity first, and then perhaps the threat.
Well,
because I think in the past you've talked about this being more powerful at this point on the B2B side rather than the B2C.
Well, I mean, certainly one area where organizations could definitely benefit is in knowledge management. I mean, I think that's a place where every organization should be looking. This has been in the lingo since the early days of the internet. The early web dream was that, because of the web, we will now be able to access all of the knowledge in our organizations, search for it through a customized search engine. And, the results on that have been mixed. But now with the possibility of being able to take the knowledge that is sort of embedded in sort of unstructured text and train something to understand it in its own way and be a resource for people in your company, I think there's a huge opportunity from that, whether you're in the pharma sector, whether you're sort of creating specialized chemicals for paints, or whether you're in financial services or legal services. Knowledge management is certainly sort of a priority.
And if there is a digital twin, then you could leave the company and your digital twin could continue to run operations or R&D or whatever.
I think up to a point, but there's sort of a balancing act between how much, maybe it's not that different from when in some organizations, when you delegate to an employee, you're always sort of striking a balance between how much should I give up and how much should I keep to myself, how much should I preserve my own position. So you're going to probably face an equivalent thing with your digital twin, but we're in a much less understood space. I think for organizations, definitely looking at customer engagement and interaction, that's definitely a space where AI has so far failed to really deliver until these large language models came along. We've all faced the frustrations of shouting at, sort of these voice response systems over the phone. And then we look at Siri, and Siri seems to understand what we say. And we wonder, and the answer is because Siri is customized to you. Now, once we enter this area where large language model, where there's enough technology to parse what you're saying and convert it into text, and the large language models are trained on specialized areas, both on the sales point of view and the customer support point of view, there's definitely low-hanging fruit for most organizations.
Sounds interesting. So, Arun, you've sort of traversed many themes and subjects in your career.
I scatter the dots all over the place, and giving it to you to connect.
But and I'm talking over time as well. But today you're focused on AI, and obviously this is a very, very important phase, and perhaps more, critical and important at the same time. How are you spending your own time trying to keep up with this? Because this is something that everyone is literally grappling with, and without knowing even what it can do, as opposed to creators of other things who knew exactly what their inventions could do.
Yeah, I think it's most of us are playing a battle of catch up, where I'm fortunate. I was programming as a kid. I built expert systems when I was in college. And so I'm starting with an advantage relative to most business professors, because I have some sort of background in computer science. But even I've had to spend, in the early days of LLMs, I was spending a few hours a day just trying to figure out exactly what the technology capabilities are. So on the AI front, I think that has slowed a little. You have to be willing to invest a couple of months in getting up to speed with how these things work, at least at a high conceptual level. In terms of other things that I'm thinking about, outside of AI, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this move towards digital sovereignty. There are countries that not just on the privacy front, but on other fronts, there seems to be a trend towards wanting sort of national self-sufficiency in the creation of digital of different kinds. You've seen the US moving towards wanting to become more self-sufficient on the semiconductor and chips front.
Kick out TikTok, which India has done already.
Absolutely, on the social media front. You see the EU struggling to reconcile the fact that they don't have a cloud provider. So they are dependent on the US and China for cloud provision. Should we sort of bring this in-house? So it's an interesting move because China was the original example of a digitally sovereign country, right? For the last 10 years, they have built their own sort of tech stack, so to speak, on all dimensions. But if you look beyond the US, the EU, India, and China, I worry that this will harm other smaller countries who are certainly not well served by trying to invent everything themselves. Forget about semiconductors, which is impossible. But even on the cloud front or the social media front, information front, you're much better off if you
share.
Yeah, if you have access to global technology. In some ways, global platforms for all of their ills can provide a check in certain ways, on certain kinds of government activities, and so it's it's not something that I've drawn any strong conclusions about yet. It's just an interesting trend that I think is in the early stages and that we'll be talking about a lot in the next few years.
Yeah, and it's something that's pretty live as a theme in India as well.
Yeah.
For example, you have localization of servers.
Yep.
MasterCard and Visa had to localize their data, otherwise they couldn't operate and so on. And I'm sure that's an extension. But I do want to come back on that theme at a slightly later point and maybe spend half an hour or some time just quizzing you and getting your thoughts on it.
For sure.
On that note, Arun, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Govind. I hope I managed to connect at least some of the dots.
Absolutely, and left us all with a lot to think about and worry about, rightly so. So thank you once again.
All right, well, great to be here as always.
Thank you.